Hey, and welcome to this week's episode of Homescreen. I'm Jim Safford. I'm a product lead here at 11FS. And today I'm joined by Will Jones, who is the head of design here at 11FS. And we're going to be talking about brand volume, how you can dial that up and down and get the most out of that for your products. Hey Will, how are you doing today, mate?
Yeah, I'm not bad. What about yourself, Jim?
Yeah, good. So first off, could you give us a rundown of the work that you've been doing with the team recently, and how that translates into this new handbook that's been brought out?
Sure. I mean, some viewers of this may have seen we've just put out into the wild our handbook for minimum lovable brand. So we've been working with different teams sort of around the world, creating and launching new ventures for the last 2 or 3 years. And a big part of that has been developing how we approach brand creation alongside, creating products and businesses. I think a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of minimum lovable product, the sense that just creating an MVP, something viable, is not really enough, with MLP being the approach to take something to market that brings the maximum amount of love back from early adopters with the minimum amount of effort. And to create something that gets love from customers, like brand is a huge part of that, and this is a recognition of that. I think when we talk about minimum, what we really mean is, a lot of people tend to rush MVPs to market, focusing around what it does. The brand is almost a backseat, and we believe that's not really enough. But then also we've seen a lot of businesses go all out, like spend a lot of money and a lot of time on a full branding exercise and put something to market, only to find out that they need to pivot, that their audience slightly shifts once they're beyond early adopters and they're scaling, and it's almost a lot of wasted effort. So it's finding that sort of Goldilocks approach. What is the just right in between? And I guess thinking about minimum lovable brand, big word of that is lovable. While your customers can kind of love what your product does for them, really nailing brand on top of that sort of can dial that up all the way from like making it feel really authentic, all the way to actually having people advocates for your brand. And a big part of that we've found is making a proper connection with the culture that you're creating this for. So I think a lot of the businesses that we create things for, they're not about to splash out on a TV ad when they're just sort of wanting to test whether something's right or not. And actually, what are the connections you can make with culture so that your brand feels authentic and it feels like it's a real response to, and not just a need state in the customer, but something that needs to happen as a change in society as well. And our method is both sort of lean in terms of the way that it's minimal, but also baking in a lot of the chances for your brand to become lovable. And finally, I guess it's the recognition that a lot of these brands are launching digitally first, which is really relevant to kind of what we're talking about today, because a big part of that, not just sort of how you approach it and bake it into your product sprints, but is also sort of how your brand is felt and experienced through UI, and sort of the products that people use every day.
That's a really cool overview of kind of what we're trying to do with this handbook. But what's the kind of, if you were to boil it down to a series of fundamentals or kind of like key things, then how can you get that branding right from the start? And what's the main experience you're looking for there?
I've been focusing specifically on sort of executing brand through UI and sort of making that product experience feel unique. That being super important, because looking at sort of apps and whatever digital experience you're creating today, a lot of them are very flat, they're very pared back, and like there's a homogenous approach to a lot of things. And that's really good because like customers know intuitively how to pick things up and use them a lot more than they used to, because we're following the same patterns, and we're creating these type hierarchies and color roles that help to guide people, but actually they start to look and feel the same. And especially in app, you don't have we shouldn't have your app logo splashed over everything to remind people that you're the one providing them that service. So the big thing is knowing like you kind of said at the top of the show, when to dial it up and when to dial it back. And we talk about this in terms of high brand and low brand, and thinking about sort of the main, like simplifying it, the main ingredients we have to execute brand and UI: identity and tone. When we think about low brand, it's really around consistency, but also there's really subtle nuances that bring through the brand into every little element. So thinking about color roles, type hierarchy, iconography and shape language, as well as the micro interactions in apps. It's kind of thinking of examples like Airbnb, where you have almost this shape language and a loop from their logo, where you can see that come through into the iconography. The iconography is the same weight as the type, and it's examples of brands like this that kind of get that to feel really right. And that is an art in itself. Thinking of tone in there, there's a lot of how like your brand's tone of voice can come through your UX writing. Those are little hints that guide you through an experience, as well as sort of branded terms. But I think the real thing to get right is sort of, where are your high brand moments? And we'll go into these, I presume, in the journey that we're going to have a look at. But there's sort of 5 areas where we think sort of dialing up brand is appropriate and can be a benefit to your product. So the first is sort of aligning with your service's main purpose. So when you've just completed the task that your app has, or your product has set out to do, really dial up brand and hero that. I mean, it could be that your product just does one thing. Thinking of what Shazam used to be, they could be super high brand and put a big old branded button on it because it does one thing. But also there's every other moment that is a win for the customer. The third area is sort of, you're going to need to use your brand to reassure people, and at a point where you're making them wait, or there's something particularly risky that you're asking them to do, that's where you can dial it up as well. There's also just, if you have a function that's really, really ownable, being able to brand that up. And finally, and not really a benefit to the customer, but a benefit to the brand themselves, there's a chance to dial it up to make sure that people will use some of the premium features within your app that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise. And examples of these 5 things might be, say, when you've achieved a goal, you're making investment, when you've completed onboarding, when you want someone to, for example, turn on features. I think getting that right is not just from a consistency perspective, like really important, because if you dial it up in all the wrong places, it's going to feel flashy and confusing and actually damage sort of the first thing that your app should be doing, which is to be usable. Yeah.
And I think the best example we can talk about today, based on what we've seen, is Wealthsimple, which is a Canadian like robo-advisory kind of wealth manager system. It's kind of based in Canada, but they have operations in the UK and the US. They kind of like manage portfolios. So think, companies like Nutmeg and 𝗛𝗂𝗀𝗲𝗲𝗲𝗲, rather than those kind of like sort of pump and dump investment platforms like Freetrade and Robinhood. So there's an initial kind of like, I think the main thing to note is that, as with any of these experiences, they need to convey a sense of like privilege or that kind of like silky glove service or something like that, which they have to now find a way to move away from kind of human-based advisors to a more digital or UI-based experience. So we'll take a look at that in the journey. And then finally, from your perspective, why is Wealthsimple a good example of high brand and low brand moments in this sense?
So they have like you were saying, needing to convey that sense of an added level of service and the prestige that comes with that, while balancing that with feeling new and modern and digital, and like they're not going to have like an old world bank approach to things. They have this nice balance between feeling quite staid, quite refined, but then they have quite an elegant like illustration and animation language that they can employ at those moments to dial it up. They also do quite a nice job of having features within there that they've managed to term and brand themselves. I mean, you've seen like Apple be the masters of that. So every basic thing on your phone has a like some fancy name that Apple has given to it, and we don't question that. We just refer to things like FaceTime and whatever else it is. And I think Wealthsimple kind of do a good job of that as well. I mean, there's plenty of other things as well in terms of consistency of the way they've guided people through experiences. So I think they are a really nice example. There's plenty of sort of others out there. You'll see A lot of the regularly championed sort of neobanks doing this quite well as well. But I think Wealthsimple is a really nice example of this.
Adding money to the investment. And the first thing to note is that kind of illustrative flair at the beginning, right before we go anywhere close to adding money to the account. Dialing down, as we mentioned here, the volume, but then there's some neat kind of little color spikes at the bottom of the page there to kind of, I guess, guide you further through the process. And then a nice kind of neat kind of assumptions box there, which says, we don't quite know what this is going to happen, but this is our best bet. Where are we up to now? So this is a linked bank account, and we've got the dates, and then a nice confirmation message with these coins sort of dropping from the sky, kind of like a little bit of one of those coin machines you'll find at 𝗛𝗺𝗀𝗀𝗲𝗀𝗲. What do they do well in that experience? What are the things that Wealthsimple are leveraging from what we were talking about a minute ago, to kind of really create that sense of anticipation or excitement to load money into your account? And it's essentially like, you know, what their main thing to do is, which is to get customers onto the platform spending money.
I mean, thinking back to a lot of things I said coming into this, I think they've got it bang on when to dial the brand back to real consistencies and when to like really amplify it. Because thinking about what they're actually asking someone to do and what they're actually asking someone to understand, they're taking on a lot here. Like there's risk involved, there's a lot of terms involved, there's a lot of variables involved. And actually throughout that flow, you wouldn't expect the brand to be shouting at you at all. You want it to be taking a back seat and guiding you. So actually thinking first about the language that they're using throughout the areas where they're trying to explain the investment you can make, actually that's super functional. It's not super highly like bank language. It's still words the customer understands, but it isn't dumbing it down at all. So this wouldn't be a point to make your tone of voice at its most like fun come through, because someone's going to lose trust in the brand there. So they've picked a really nice balance of almost upskilling people that aren't used to this terminology while keeping like the UX writing and the labels really simple. So that's bang on for a lot of this journey. I think the design language, it's interesting actually, because they seem to have made a conscious choice. The Wealthsimple logo it has serifs. It feels a little bit more like it's harking back to a golden age where there was this level of service, but actually that hasn't come through into the UI. And I feel like that's a deliberate choice because it does feel a little bit more artistic than it does helpful. So I think that's quite useful throughout that journey. But as well, they've paired their brand color with a secondary color that it's kind of that neutral middle point, because that yellow is quite like, it's bright and it's exciting, and it speaks to people that are looking for, you know, change and create something different. Whereas they've got almost this teal coming through in the background. Teal's a great color because it's like all of the color associations of green, so things to do with growth and obvious stuff around there, as well as blue, the classic banking color, which has like associations with wisdom and trust, and actually that being the thing that you put your ticks in and you put your confirmation bits in and you put your graphs in. Actually it's not shouting at you and it's reassuring you. But throughout that journey there does seem to be a real consistency to how you're guided with the interaction language and the voice. But looking at that endpoint, oh, that's nice, isn't it? You've got this like really nice almost unexpected animation where coins are raining from the sky. And I mean, that's a little bit clunky and forced, but because the animation's like quite refined, it's not childish, it kind of feels quite a cool, unexpected thing. And actually thinking about that being a moment that is, like we were saying before, totally aligned with what your app does, and also a win for the customer. You're ticking two of those boxes already. So I think it's a really nice thing to put in there.
I really like that. There's this kind of like it seems to me, and I think this is true in the next journey as well, that it's sort of like the experience is bookended with two moments of really high kind of branding experience.
Yeah.
But it's not as if the UI is sort of kind of like is completely low throughout it. They've found, as you mentioned before, like this way to peak the experience with like this kind of like these other moments of branding, like the teal growth chart, and it sort of seems as though they're using color in a way to be like, you know, my gold and my yellows are to do with kind of these really high moments of aspiration, and then these like more kind of matte or tealy type colors are more to do with what are the functions or what are the actual things that we're trying to achieve with this product, which I think is quite
sure.
So in terms of like the rest of the experience, like what constitutes a low brand moment for you in this instance? Like, is it the absence of design, or in some sense, or is it sort of like the small kind of the muted amounts of branding or color present?
It's very hard to have an entire absence of design unless you I mean, even a voice interface, you're going to have something designed to it. But I think I get your point. There's like there's a real consistency to the way that they apply brand, and a logic to like the way that they assign color roles. Because I think a lot of brands, they feel it's really necessary to get their brand color and stick it on everything, and even to have it as the like the interaction color as well. I think they get a lot of that right in terms of what you term to be a low brand moment in this. Mm-hmm. I personally, this isn't a direct response to your question, but I just wanted to talk about the use of yellow.
Yeah,
I think it's so hard to work with from an accessibility perspective, because there's this really tiny sweet spot in the sort of scale of yellows where it's either brown or you get into this sort of pastel-y color. They've kind of managed to find it in between, but actually it's really hard to work with, because putting type over the top of it, it's not always going to feel that accessible and that visible. I mean, they've managed to kind of do it in this perspective, but actually when you're using your brand color as your active state for things, like you're probably ending up with a small slither of yellow, and it's quite easily missed. So I think they've sort of made a rod for their own backs in a way with the interaction language, using yellow for not just the primary call to actions, but a lot of the other things that they want to highlight. I think they're getting away with it quite well in app, because a lot of phones, high contrast, it's kind of okay, but you translate that to like a web experience, someone's going to be on an old monitor somewhere, and it's going to be a real problem.
Yeah. So your advice there is just avoid it unless you're very, very
I don't know. I mean, there's the advice for a brand to avoid their main color is never one that's well received. It's like going to a bank that's entirely red and going, do you need to use this in everything? It looks like a bad thing. And that's never good advice either. It's how do you work with the brand colors that you have to make sure that they have the right roles within the app.
Yeah, sure. Okay, the next part of the journey that we're going to talk about is related to kind of the adding of a bank account. So it's a slightly different area of functionality, but essentially you're trying to achieve the same thing, which is get users to pop money into their accounts and to start spending ultimately. So it's a direct kind of action that you're trying to promote a user to do. Right, so again, it's a slightly different illustrative style used there. And the kind of the idea of like a magnet. And then there's this sort of progress bar at the top, which is talking to us about kind of how far along that process we are of connecting our bank account. And then they're using a service called Plaid, which you might remember was bought like by Visa. I think it was it last year? I don't know. But then via Visa, they're able to kind of connect to different bank accounts, either via APIs or via a screen scraping service. So this is a connection. A loading screen's introduced here, which kind of quite neatly and simply shows off a little ticking clock. And then we can select the different accounts from within that we're looking to top up that Wealthsimple account with. So we've got the ability to choose an account to top up to, and then that nice illustrative style again, that sort of like velour, very plush kind of illustrative style, and finished off with this little elephant guy. Cool. So the really interesting thing about that, from my perspective, is that Wealthsimple have, as we've seen in that previous journey, they've got their house in order with their own UI and their own kind of design experience. But then they have to do this really, really complex thing of introducing a new, like essentially a new bedfellow directly into their service, into one of their most kind of important, highly functional parts of their experience. So kind of, what are you relying upon there from a company like Plaid in order to make sure that you maintain that strong sense of identity that you've had from the very beginning?
It's interesting. I think for me, the question is, how strong does your identity need to be through that experience? So if we look at other experiences that the user has elsewhere in digital interfaces, they're kind of used to being handed off to other services quite often. If you think about the amount of times you have to use your Google login for literally everything you use for work, or probably a bunch of other things as well, and Facebook as well, presumably on a few other things. I think you learn to trust when handed off to those other experiences. But if you look at the Facebook experience and you look at the Google experience for when you're using that sign-on method, you see that they've really pared that back to an incredibly simple instruction. Yeah. Whenever there's a graphic, it's literally just usually to show two things playing really nicely together. And often it's good to play back the logo of the thing that you're trying to access with the logo of the thing that is giving you access. Yeah. It's interesting in this context though, because unlike sort of Google and Facebook, people aren't super aware of them. I mean, if you think about Facebook, they've lost a lot of trust. That might be a good thing, that it's not one of those sort of big four that's nicking all of your data. But in this instance, I think they do a nice job actually to sort of pare that back to a simple instruction, and actually having that handoff handled by a third party. Yeah. It'd be really interesting to see how that disrupts that journey for people. But actually, from a brand sort of risk perspective, because you don't have a lot of control over that experience, it's probably better not to heavily brand that yourself, unless you can work with that company providing it to make it feel seamlessly integrated in what you do. Yeah.
And I think one of the great things that Plaid do in this instance is that instead of focusing on the experience of the product they're trying to get, in this instance, like a Wealthsimple, the thing that they're trying to connect people to, they're actually focusing on the other side of that equation. So like the brands that you're going to get your money from. And not only, I think that does a few things. The first is it allows you to not have to worry too much about how that kind of experience fits in with your design language from Wealthsimple's perspective. But on the other end, it's kind of like, oh, this is my bank, this is someone I trust, here's how I kind of like leverage some of that trust in order to make this a more seamless experience. But they, yeah.
I think looking at, that's reminded me of something, like looking at the experience that you get from the bank at the other end. Yeah. When we're thinking about sort of when to dial up brand and when to dial it back, increasing color and having your brand color all over the background of something that's like a high brand moment for me. And actually I question if your color is sort of this deep green, does it belong in an experience like this where it's going to be incredibly jarring? It's probably quite reassuring to see that is the bank that that you're connecting to. But I think a logo does that without having to completely disrupt an experience that should feel quite dialed back and very, very functional.
Yeah, agreed. So how do you feel about this notion then of like an illustration or a form of design being a call to action? So like, for example, there was a very clear, as you mentioned at the top, like a very clear incentive here for the bank, for Wealthsimple rather, which is if we connect people's accounts to us, we can more easily get their deposits and or we can get them to invest in our product. What is the incentive here from, how do illustrations work in supporting that?
I think it comes down to how they've sort of branded up those features so that they feel really attractive for the customer that's using this thing. Like bringing through that, like, because throughout the experience they've aligned those illustrations with moments that are a win for the customer. So when they start to invest, presumably, you know, when money comes in, like when they finished onboarding, they'll have seen these throughout it. And actually it's these little serendipitous moments that give us this rush of endorphins, and like it's really fleeting, but actually the build up of those over time throughout using the product is what makes you love it, but it also makes you associate them with things that are good for you. So if the bank is trying to get you to do something that's kind of also a win for them, and you see this, like this graphic language that's coming through as well, subconsciously you're thinking, brilliant, that's given me something that is aligned with a win for me and what the app is trying to do for me. Because the example there is it is trying to upsell to like a premium feature or another feature that they want you to use to make you sort of more hooked into the product, because it's doing more things for you, but also gives them more data. So I think it's quite interesting. Yeah, I think.
Nice. Cool. Well, I think that's just those are the two journeys we wanted to go through. But thank you very much for chatting through those with me, Will. If people wanted to find out a little bit more about the work that you've been doing and kind of how that can affect their work, what should they do, or where should they go?
So they can come to the 11FS site and obviously find a lot more about what we do. Also, following 11FS on LinkedIn, we're currently posting a lot of content around branding and design.
Thanks very much for checking this episode out today. If you haven't already, go subscribe to 11FS's YouTube channel so you can never miss an episode of this and all the other great content we're pushing out really regularly. Also check out pulse@11fs.com to email us to find out more about the product that powers this show, and also head over to pulse.11fs.com to check out the product itself. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next week.
Pleasure. Cheers.